Hey, music fans, welcome to the show. It is time to dive into another band. I'm starting up another series, this time with Jacob Martin, and we are going to be going through the British rock band Genesis. Jacob, I have a few questions for you. One, what are just kind of your initial thoughts going into this project? Because I know that you've heard a few Genesis songs, but aren't extremely familiar with them.
Yeah, it's fascinating because it wasn't until maybe a couple of years ago that I realized that the era of Genesis that I'm familiar with is not the original era of Genesis. Like I'm more familiar with Genesis led by Phil Collins, especially some of their 80s stuff. Invisible Touch, In Too Deep, Land of Confusion. In fact, actually, before we went on the live stream, oh, actually not live stream, the Zoom recording, whatever we're recording this on, I actually heard Land of Confusion on the radio today. Fun
Oh,
fact.
I love that song.
Great. I love that song too. And I didn't realize until uh I think recently that there was a whole different era of Genesis where Phil Collins was the drummer and Peter Gabriel was the lead singer. I'm like, I did not know this. And it wasn't until meeting you and Nick. I think you showed me, I think, occasional Genesis songs during this early era, and it got me intrigued to want to dive into some more Genesis, especially this early era with a different singer.
Yes. So there are two things that I would like to accomplish with this series. Number one, and that's not going to be till later, but I want to show you how Phil Collins works better in the context of a band. As much as I love his solo work, I love his work with Genesis even better, even though he's not on this album. But B, you've been very interested in some of the longer songs the more jammy songs on here, and just based on that, I have a feeling that you might dislike progressive rock. And so, of all the progressive rock bands, Genesis is kind of one of the better ones to start with. Because if you start with like Yes, you're gonna be like, "What the heck is this?" But we're gonna be going album by album through Genesis until eventually we get through all the albums. And I know Jason will be joining on some of them. Here's the thing. I love when we do all of the videos together, but it is difficult sometimes to get everybody on the video with everyone's schedules. So what we're doing is we're splitting off into two teams. Jacob and I are going to be reviewing Genesis by ourselves, and then Nick and Briar will be reviewing Genesis, and then Jason is just going to show up on both of the series with whichever group he decides to. And I don't know if through the magic of video editing I can make a super cut of everyone's opinion in one video eventually. I don't know if I'd even want to because that sounds very difficult, but that's kind of why you're going to see two different Genesis series, one here on the Scrap Dog Scott Records channel, and then another one over on Townsend 505. On my SoundLab Studios channel, I'm going to make two playlists. I'm going to put like Genesis, and then I'm going to put in parentheses like Scott and Jacob's Journey, and then I'm going to put Genesis parenthesis Briar and Nick's Journey. So if you found the Genesis playlists on the SoundLab Studios channel, that's why there's two Genesis playlists, kind of explaining that. And I'm saying this for future viewers because there's not one at the moment, but there will be. Anyway, let's go ahead and dive into our album for today. Today's album is called From Genesis to Revelation. It was released in 1969, so a little bit of background information about our album for today. Genesis was formed in the mid 60s in a college in England. This college was known for having two bands, and the two bands, both of their bands had members quit, so the two bands kind of merged, and the members who remained were Peter Gabriel, Tony Banks, Mike Rutherford, and I forget the other guy's name, but he doesn't even play on this album really. And they all got together, found their love of music, and decided that they would like to join a band. And there was a fellow student there as well named Jonathan King who heard the band and thought, I'd like to be their producer and manager. And so he like takes them and gets them a record deal with Decca Records in the UK and London Records in the US. You may have heard of that label from another different band that we've been going through called the Rolling Stones. So they were on the same label for this first album. They switched labels on the next album, but um, they make this album. They made two singles, and those singles didn't really chart. And he thought maybe the band would have better success through an album. So they made an album that's kind of a loose concept album, kind of based off the Bible, kind of. And what's funny about this album is that there's lots of orchestrations on the album that the band didn't even know were going to be on the album because they were recorded after the songs. And so the guitar player Anthony Phillips was kind of upset that they did that without telling them. But that's kind of how you get the sound of this album, which is more of a psychedelic pop record, more akin to what the Bee Gees were doing at this time, rather than what you would think of it Genesis would be doing from their 70s output. So before we get to the track by track, Jacob, do you have kind of any brief thoughts about this album?
Yeah, this is interesting. As someone who's primarily familiar with like the Invisible Touch era Genesis and the That's All era Genesis with Phil Collins, I'm like, this is definitely a much different departure than I think what most people would probably expect when they hear the name Genesis. One, because Phil Collins isn't even in the band yet. And I'm familiar with a little bit of Peter Gabriel, more so some of his solo stuff, and he does have some good songs. So it's weird because this is not what you expect with Genesis. I think in the 70s they were primarily a prog rock act, and this is definitely not prog. It's more of a psychedelic album, like a concept album at that. Like you said, loosely based on the Bible. I thought they'd go more with that because that's definitely a fascinating topic to explore. But I think loose is putting it lightly. This is a
Loose.
very weird album, but it is interesting. It is different. It's not a. I don't think it's a great album, but I do think it's an interesting start.
It's definitely an interesting start. My brief thoughts on this album. I definitely like it a lot better than whenever I first heard it, but it's still not my favorite Genesis album. Definitely knowing what they would become later in the 70s and the 80s, I'm definitely a bigger fan of those albums, but it's an interesting start for this band. Kind of interesting to see where they began. So, let's go ahead and dive in to the track by track. The first song on this album is called. Oh, wait, I forgot one more thing before we get to that. Kind of another fun fact about the album is that the album, whenever they were going to put it out, the record label found out that there was another band named Genesis, and so they wanted them to change the name. And a compromise was reached that they would just remove the band's name from the album. That's why all you see is just the black square that says From Genesis to Revelation on it. Now, at least in the US, later on, they would put the band's name back on the album real big so that you knew who made it. But uh, because they took the name off, this album was placed in the religious records and apparently only sold 600 copies when it first was released
Oh wow.
because nobody knew what it really was. Kind of a fun fact there, but well, we're going to get into our track by track. The first song is called When the Sour Turns to Sweet.
Okay. I actually really like this song. I thought this was one of the better songs on the album. I actually do like the 60s psychedelic sound, especially some of the other artists that were big at that time, Jefferson Airplane, Jimi Hendrix, um, even the Beatles dabbled in psychedelic music and they did some really cool stuff with it. This one's more on the poppier side compared to some of the other acts that was diving into this genre, but I thought this one had a really catchy groove to it, and I actually really like the horns on this track. I think out of all the songs on this album, this is one of the more memorable ones, and I think it opens the album quite well.
Yeah, I really like this song. I definitely think it's a very good way to start the album and to open up Genesis's career with the boom boom boom. And then like it's funny that the first few words are just "We're waiting for you. Come join us now." I think that's kind of self-aware. Another band that did that was Chicago, where the first line written on their first song was "Hey there, everybody." Um, but yeah, this is one of the better songs on this album, and I like it. The next song is called "In the Beginning."
All right. This one, I think it's one of this one's one of the more explicit Bible reference song. This is obviously based on Genesis and the creation of the world. Uh, like I said, I do like the sound on this album. I don't think it's an amazing song by any means. I'm not really sure if like Peter Gabriel's vocals actually match the lyrics of the song. I don't know if Phil Collins would have done this one any better or not. I think I it's weird describing it because on one hand I think there's cool stuff in this song like the production and everything. I respect the idea, but I'm not sure if it fully works. I don't know. I guess I'm kind of mixed on it more than anything else.
Yeah. So I definitely like what they're going for. I like that all the songs just fade into the other songs, kind of
Yeah.
without pausing. And it's cool how they have like the sound effects at the beginning. But here's my biggest gripe with this album, and you're going to hear this a lot, is a lot of these songs sound very samey.
Hmm.
And when I'm looking at the titles, I can't exactly remember what song went with which song because they all sound very similar. Like very just super produced with the orchestra and the horn section and Peter Gabriel like singing.
Yeah, I think that's kind of my problem with it too. I've heard the songs twice. I've listened to the album twice. I'm like, yeah, there's some cool production on this album. There's clearly talent involved, but even which song was which again?
Yeah. I will say I listened to their second album today and it's a major improvement from this album. Okay, so now we are going to get to the next song, the Fireside Song.
Um, I think this is one of the better songs on the album. I think it's got a chorus that actually does stand out. Of like, once upon a time there was confusion, disappointment, and disillusion. I'm like, because of that, I think I like this one a little bit more than some of the other songs on the album. Uh, Not really sure what the song is about, but I think it's still.
Well, I will say that's going to kind of be a theme with Genesis songs because the lyrics are very ambiguous on all of their songs.
Yeah, yeah, but I thought it was one of the more memorable tracks on the album, so I'll give it that. I at least remember
Um,
something about it.
yeah, I like this song. Tony Banks's piano playing is very good on this song, as it is on every Genesis song. He's an amazing keyboard player. It's one of the more memorable songs on the album, but it still doesn't exactly like. I don't know if I would go back and just like, okay, I'm ready to listen to some Genesis today. What do I want to? I want to listen to the Fireside song. I don't know if I would ever say that. Okay, so the next song is The Serpent.
Yeah, I think this one's a little better, but in the beginning, there's some interesting lyrics in there. I think this one's more based on like I think the fall of man with Adam and Eve and the serpent. So I think this is like there's at least two songs that are like explicitly tied to the Bible, and I respect it for that. I don't think it's one of my favorite songs on the album, but I do think it's a well produced track. I like the guitar work on it. This is one of the more psychedelic songs on the album. And I think it's a neat little experiment.
Yeah, whenever I looked and it's like it's a concept album loosely based on the Bible. There's really only this song, and I forget what the other one is, but there's not really like I don't really understand it very much.
Yeah, it's not.
I don't
Yeah, I
really get
think
the
that was one of
connection.
my. I think that was one of my big disappointments with the album because I was like, I thought it would be more of a. I thought they would really go all out with doing a concept album based on the
Well, I will
Bible. And some
say
people,
if you want to hear a song that's a little bit more based on the Book of Revelation, Supper's Ready delves into that a lot better than this album
oh
does.
wow,
It's kind of what Supper's Ready is about. It's kind of an interpretation of the Book of Revelation and about like the second coming.
oh wow, sure that's
That
a better song then.
that is what many Genesis fans consider to be their best song. So
Hmm.
you'll like that a lot better than this album.
Yeah,
I like Anthony Phillips' acoustic guitar playing on this song, and I like the more frantic nature of it. Okay, now we're going to get to "Am I Very Wrong?"
I think this is one of my favorite songs on the album. I think it's a really good ballad. I actually like Peter Gabriel's vocal delivery. Am I very wrong? And I think this one I think deals with maybe like the I think if you want to interpret it as like a biblical song, maybe about the sinful condition of man, maybe. And I think there's a little bit of relatability to that because we all have our own flaws and our own
Hmm.
imperfections. I like the piano on the track. Uh, yeah, I wish I had more to say on these songs. I don't think it's a stellar album, but I think this is a
Once again,
pretty solid track.
please stand by because everybody says this is one of their worst albums. They get so much better on the next one. Like it's a night and day difference with the next. Well, you're gonna listen to the knife and you're gonna go, yes, I see what they were talking about.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is one of the better songs. Tony Banks is the hero of this one with the piano. Peter Gabriel's voice is really good. This is one of the best songs on the album. Oh, now we're gonna get to another one of the best songs on the album, in my opinion, "In the Wilderness."
Yeah, I would agree. This is one of the better songs on the album. Again, I think this one has a very memorable chorus. I forgot how the lyrics go. It's like,
Music, all I hear is music. That's like the
yeah,
only. That's one of the only things I can remember about that. I've listened to the album two and a half times, and that's one of the only things I can remember about it.
yeah. I think there's some good horns on it. It's one of the few times you actually hear the different members of Genesis sing together, and I don't think Genesis normally do harmonies. There's not much in the Phil
No,
Collins era. So it's cool hearing it in this early era of Genesis, and it
the
actually
only
sounds pretty good on
the
this
only
song.
harmonies I can think of are when in the '70s era Genesis, Peter Gabriel sing, and then Phil Collins does high harmonies a lot. But that's about
Oh,
the only harmonies I can think of they do.
yeah. So I can't think of much in the like when Phil Collins led.
Yeah, I can't think of any off the top of my head. I know there's some that maybe Phil Collins will double track his voice, but nothing off the top of my head.
Yeah. Like I do really like this one. This is probably in the top five on this album.
Yeah, this is another one of the best songs on this album. Probably my favorite on the album. A little spoiler there. Um, it's a very catchy chorus. Again, I say it's the best one on the album, but like when I'm thinking about like this album, I'm just thinking about how I'd rather listen to another Genesis album mainly. And I know I definitely like it better than the first time I listened to it, but listening to this again, I'm just realizing that it might not be exactly one of my favorites. Um, we're now gonna get to the Conqueror.
Yeah. One of the cool things I like about this song is like when this song opens, it actually starts off with the melody from the last song. And
Yes.
that's a cool thing I like about concept albums is when like songs reference other songs and they kind of build off each other. That's one of the things I love about Pink Floyd's The Wall.
Yeah,
Is
you
there's
get
a lot of
that.
songs that do that.
You get that
Yeah.
in a lot of songs.
But I think aside from that, like the song has like I thought it was catchy when I listened to it, but then when talking to you about it now, there's not much I remember out of this song. So I guess it's one that's like I like it when you listen to it, but then afterward it's like, what happened in it again?
Yeah, and I'm not gonna lie. In between, while you're like, as soon as I say the name, I have to play a few seconds of the song just to remember it.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is one of the ones that I think is one of the better songs on the album. The definite standout is the guitar intro at the beginning where they go bow now 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 now. It's kind of a callback to the last song, but again, not anything too amazing on this particular album. We got In Hiding. It's the next song.
Yeah. I think this one's a solid track. I like the harmonies on the chorus are pretty good. Some interesting wordplay in the song I do remember. Being in hiding, being on top of a mountain, floating down a river. I I think what was it something about taking off my clothes that cover my face or something like that. That's a weird line. That one, that's a line I won't forget anytime soon. But again, there's like nothing on this album that's like amazing, but I do like the production and sound on all these tracks. I think my other main issue with this album is, yeah, I think in an alternate reality, Genesis could have been a good psychedelic rock band, but they would have been drowned out by so many other better acts. Like especially when you compare to like Jimi Hendrix and Jefferson Airplane, and even when the Beatles went into that sound in their later years, I was like, yeah, it's hard competing with that, and I think you can see why this album didn't do so
You
well.
want to know what I think now that I'm thinking about it? This album was released 2 years too late. If Genesis had released this in 1967, it would have been a lot bigger, and they probably would have been moving to more progressive things by 1969. Because in 1969, you've got like King Crimson releases in the Court of the Crimson King, which is a like one of the first progressive rock albums. So that they're already way ahead of. At the same time, Yes was released their first album. Emerson, Lake and Palmer is forming. So like you've already got other progressive rock bands that are way ahead of them at this point, and it's like this album sounds like it should have been released 2 years earlier.
Yeah.
Which
So
I think it was recorded in 1967, so that might explain why.
okay. But I guess by the time it came out, I guess people were starting to think it sounded dated by this point.
Probably, because 1969 was a very big year in music history. That's kind of when music changed from, because 1967 was the big psychedelic year. 1968, everything was switching back to kind of a more straightforward sound. And then 1969, you have this big explosion of new acts. All the acts who had already been established had released some of their biggest albums, like Abbey Road by the Beatles, Tommy by the Who. CCR had released their three big albums. Led Zeppelin has released their first two albums. So the musical direction is shifting more towards like like the rock is really taking off at this point. And so the psychedelic music does sound a bit dated.
Gotcha.
Okay, so now we are going to get to
Did you
One
say did
Day.
you share your thoughts on the last track?
Oh, I don't think I did. Um, I like the slower vibe. I like the guitar playing, the pick me up, push me down. That's kind of catchy. But once again, nothing too amazing on this album. The next song is One Day.
Yeah, I think this is a solid little love song. I think it's got good production on it. I like the strings in the background, which is on I think a lot of the songs on this album, but It's nothing to write home about.
Yeah, this is one of those songs that sounds samey. I can't really differentiate. Any of the songs from here till the end don't really stand out other than The Silent Sun. All the other songs kind of sound the same, in my opinion. The next song is going to be Window.
Yeah, this one I think is one of the weaker songs on the album. There's nothing about this one that really stands out. I think the one part that does stand out, there's this part where Peter Gabriel sings a lower note in the chorus. I'm like, I'm not used to hearing Peter Gabriel hit a lower register, but that was
Right.
pretty cool. But other than that, I don't remember much about this song.
Yeah, same criticism as One Day. It's very samey, and I can't. If you were to play a song, and it was like, is this One Day or is this Window? Like, I probably wouldn't be able to tell you. Although I will say, I probably at least could differentiate those two rather than the four Dust My Broom clones on Mr. Wonderful.
Oh, yeah, I'm not gonna let that song go, are you?
No. Okay. Now we got In Limbo.
Yeah, this one again, not that memorable. I don't. I think this is the one I remember the least out of all the songs on the album.
Yeah.
It's like probably my least favorite song, I guess, in that regard.
Yeah, I don't really remember it much, but whenever I play I played a little bit of it and I remembered one thing about it. This song is mixed terribly. It has Peter Gabriel singing in your left ear, and I don't kid you not, all of the instruments are in your right ear.
So,
So, like the voices are in this ear and the instruments are in this ear, and it's very annoying.
which I'm sure listening to it with headphones, it's like, yeah, that's not good mixing.
No. And like the Beatles stereo mixes have the same problem, but up with the Beatles, I have the mono versions, and so those are a lot better. This album does have a mono mix, but mono was phasing out in 1969, so it's very difficult to get a hold of that album. As well as like it's 1969, people should be making better stereo mix, and people should and were making better stereo mixes at this point.
Hmm.
Like they're resulting back to the mid 1960s techniques when like you're having like Creedence Clearwater Revival and Abbey Road and Led Zeppelin at this point. Like people should know how to do good stereo mixes at this point. But they didn't. And what's the next song? We are now going to get to okay. This is one of the better songs on the second half of this album. We have The Silent Sun.
This is probably the best song on the second half of the album, if we're being honest.
Yeah.
I mean, again, I don't think it's great, but I do like the acoustic guitar work on the song, some really good harmonies. I think you were making the comparison earlier that I think this sounded like what the Bee Gees were doing in the 60s when they were doing some of that folksier style music before they went disco. And I can definitely see that comparison. Now, it's not as good as the early Bee Gees songs that are really
No.
good, but you know what? I do, I guess, admire the effort. It's one of the better songs on the album by default.
I have the Bee Gees first album, which is this album reminds me so much of the Bee Gees first album. But Bee Gees first is so much better than this album, in my opinion. The songs on that album are a lot more memorable than this album. Um, Silent Sun was actually the debut single from Genesis, so they released that single, and then they ended up putting it on the album. I definitely see how this one has the single potential, but even then, it's not really that great. Okay, and if anyone thinks that I hate Genesis, watch any of the other reviews other than Calling All Stations. I'm going to turn to that album. But any of the other reviews, I'll have amazing things to say about Genesis. It's just this first album is a bit more rough than the other ones. Okay, now we have finally made it to the final track on this album, A Place to Call My Own.
All right. I think it's kind of a weak closer. Peter Gabriel, I mean, he sings pretty good on it, but I don't know. To me, it feels more like a demo track than anything else. Like he sings it, and it just ends, and it's just under 2 minutes. I'm like, really? It's not really the best way to close the album. I wish you'd close it with something with some kind of pizzazz to it, like the opening track.
Yeah. Yeah, not a very strong way to close this album. I might get this album just to have it in the Genesis collection, but this isn't one I'm going to be listening to a whole lot. Um, they're capable of so much better. Even just on the next album, it gets so much better. And that is going to bring us to our top 5 songs on the album.
All right, top 5 songs. This is kind of hard. I actually do have two honorable mentions. In Hiding and the Serpent. I think we're close to making top 5. They were semi decent tracks. Again, nothing amazing on this album, but I was able to come up with a top 5. Number 5, Silent Sun. Number 4, Fireside Song. Number 3, Am I Very Wrong? Number 2, In the Wilderness. And number 1, When the Sour Turns to Sweet.
Okay, so my number 1 is In the Wilderness. Number 2, When the Sour Turns to Sweet. Number 3, Silent Sun. Number 4, Fireside Song. And number 5, Am I Very Wrong? And now the score from 1 to 10. I'm interested to hear this.
Okay. So I don't love this album. I don't think it's a garbage album. I think there's some interesting stuff on it, but it doesn't feel like Genesis. It feels like this is a band that's starting to find their sound. I think, caught up in like what the big trend was at the time and just rolled with it. I do like the production on it, and it's an admirable effort trying to do a concept album, but these definitely are not the best songs. And it does get repetitive after a while, but because I respect the idea, I'm actually going to go 6 out of 10 on it. I don't hate this album. It's an okay album for what it is. I know their other albums get better, when they find their sound. I think both in when Peter Gabriel was in the band and then when Phil Collins became the lead vocalist, and I think they went more out of a kind of like a more mainstream direction. I think it worked for that too. Um, but yeah, this one's an interesting start. I don't hate it, but it's definitely not great either.
I'm going to go slightly higher, but not much, just by a quarter. I'm going to give it a 6.25. Definitely respect them for the beginnings. I like the production on the album. Peter Gabriel's voice is good. The musicianship is good. It's just they do so much better on pretty much any other. You can pretty much close your eyes, point to a Genesis album, their discography, and it will be better than this one. Um, I once again I do like it a lot better than when I first heard it. I thought it was terrible. Uh, I at least respect the album now, but it's not one I'm going to be listening to a bunch.
Yeah, I think I would put to me, it's kind of like Led Zeppelin's debut album. There's some interesting stuff on it, and there's songs I like on it, but I don't think it stacks compared to their other albums,
Oh
which I think are better. I
man, I
guess.
like Led Zeppelin. I like Led Zeppelin's first album a lot. But yeah, I know you didn't like that one as much, so I kind of get the comparison. But okay, we will be back next time, hopefully with much better reviews for Trespass. The second Genesis album, Phil Collins and Steve Hackett are not quite yet on the album yet. That's when we get to the third one. But the musical styling is at least much closer to what you would know them for.
Yeah, yeah. I guess I'm looking forward to diving into that one. This,
Yeah. Okay, any final words before we sign off?
um, I'm looking. I just hope the next one's better.
It will be. Trust me. Lots better. All right. Until then, music is art, art is expression. Bye, everybody, and don't forget to flip your 45s.